but I expect that those will be challenged as we discussed before in the August session, and not August, but certainly in January. The governor, I think, is very, very cognizant of the fact that this is not going to just go through without some relief. So I expect them to continue to pursue that legislation. But I think that the main thing that we have to realize is that we still have a long way to go in this fight. They have not broken ground, and even when they break ground, it's not over yet. It's certainly not a time for appeasement. Palo Alto has been great in holding the high ground and being very consistent in their positions, and I think that that's going to help out a lot. We sat down and we talked a little bit about what we should be working on, and we believe that there's a great opportunity in building alliances with education, sort of education leaders, and making it very clear that people, that they're making a choice. When you look at just the bond payments alone on their first installment, it's $750 million a year. We want people to understand that. We think that there's going to be opportunities, certainly in audit, and we know that there's already rumblings of audit hearings coming up in August. That will be taking a hard look at high-speed rail. And so we want to build those alliances with education, make sure that the state legislature continues to monitor high-speed rail, and that this continues to be a active issue in Sacramento. We don't want people to believe that just because they've got through one vote that this thing is over and a done deal. I think there's a lot of other things that have to happen. So we want to continue to fight the total project, but also we think that it's important that the city and leadership consider what lessons we learned in this last 6 months. Our representation on boards. Are we positioned there was a lot of debate about being positioned with the regional transportation agencies. And we need to think about what are legislative remedies that we can pursue that will make sure that those things don't happen again. And what can we change? So we think that there's it took a bit of the wind out of our sails to move that boat, but at the same time, when you look at the odds that we're going against, I think we made a heck of a run at it and brought it to people's attention that there are problems with this. And I think the next several months will be, the fight will continue, and I think it will continue at the same, it'll be building intensity. Certainly if there's CEQA legislation that's put forward in August, that's going to have, we're going to be back at full speed instantly as that comes forward. So there's a lot still out there. So the good news is that, we are far from done on putting this thing away. The proponents of it are far from done starting construction on it. So I hope that's some sort of good news for you.
Questions to John?
That's sort of where we think we are.
Okay. Well, I'll start by asking, what reaction have you gotten from the Sierra Club and other environmental organizations?
The initial reaction after this went through was that everybody was extraordinarily, and so it sort of went dead for a little while, but I think that they are very aware that the governor will try to make another play in CEQA. If not immediately, then shortly down the road, there will be another round of this. So I think that they are cautious, and I think that they are, a lot of the problems that they were concerned with were not solved in this legislation. A lot of the points that they put forward simply didn't appear. And this all came together very quickly, so they're unable to put together large-scale movements against this. But I think that they still have great concerns, and we want to make sure that they continue to be our allies.
Well, I hadn't seen the Sierra Club really as an ally, frankly. My reaction was that they were taken by the government. Do they see it that way?
I think that in this battle, allies are perhaps they may be very imperfect, but we have to. So I would continue to think that the Sierra Club is an ally. I think that a lot of the environmental groups were taken. If not taken, then they were sold a bill of goods that I think that they're going to realize is not going to come to fruition. So, we have to make sure that they understand the consequences of what they've signed up for. And I think we could bring them back in the fold. I think that they're going to get a big whack in the nose by the legislature when they try to go after CEQA again. And hopefully, maybe the second or third time we get hit over the head with this, they'll realize that this is that we are their allies.
Pat or Greg?
Not this time.
Okay, Greg? I guess we got no further questions. We're going to move into a discussion of the...
I have a timing question on what's going forward.
Go ahead.
John, there's been discussion about the prospect of cleanup legislation to address some of the shortcomings of the funding legislation. And we had heard that it may be going forward in the session that starts at the end of August. Have you heard anything more on that?
No, I've heard this, Pat. I've heard the same thing that you've heard, that we're expecting to go forward. Chris and Rob are supposed to be sitting down, or hopefully going to be sitting down with some of Gordon's staff to see how we can participate and help in that. I certainly hope it happens. It would be great if we could move some of those letters of intent into statute. So we hope that those things will happen, and there's we have to assume that people are going to do what they said they were going to do. So we have to trust but verify to make sure that those things do happen.
So you just mentioned these letters of intention that we've heard about. Are they public record?
They should be public record. I have not seen them yet.
Do you think you guys could get your hands on them? And
yeah, we will find out whether they actually exist. I mean, we have the committee hearing transcripts, and we have Senator Leno's speech, from the floor, where he sort of listed off what the key points were again, and we will bird dog that.
And what's the impact of a letter of intention?
Well, that's a very good question. Certainly, it has some impact if there's much ambiguity, but there doesn't seem to be too much ambiguity in the current legislation. So we want to make sure that we can move those to statute. For example, the letter of intent that exists for from former Speaker Nunez regarding cap and trade says this can only be used for the administrative function of reaching the greenhouse gas reduction. And that's one of the things that we want to argue that is the intent of the legislation before they start moving it towards high-speed rail funding in the future. But it doesn't have the binding effect of law. So I suppose we could use it in court, but I don't know whether it'll get you that far.
And did we ever get an explanation as to why they would have used a letter of intent rather than simply putting these things into law?
We have not gotten an explanation on that. I mean, I think that intuitively, I believe that it was quicker for them just to say they're going to do that and move forward. But it doesn't give you a lot of trust or faith in the process. And so I think that's why we want to. It's nice to have them, but we need to have more.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, anything else? Well, let's move then. John, can you stay on a little while? Because I think
I will. I'd like to listen to this conversation, and I'll be on mute, but so just call me out, and I'm there.
Good. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. So we move to item number 3, discussion of the recent legislation, what it means to Palo Alto, and what it means implications for the blended system.
Sure, and I'll do a brief overview, and then staff would like your input on any next steps you'd like to take going forward from here.
Well, after you speak, we have a member of the public who wishes to speak to us on this item.
Sure. Also, that'd be great. So, SB 1029 passed the Assembly on July 5th and the Senate on July 6th, signed by the Governor last week. In addition to construction of the initial construction segment in the Central Valley, it also includes a 2-mile light rail connection that will be built in Southern California, linking the existing Metro Transit to provide a 1-seat ride to Union Station with the construction in the Central Valley scheduled to begin in April 2013. Also, they'll do the Bay Area improvements, $700 million contribution to modernize the Caltrain system with matching funds, and that is scheduled at this point to be done in 2019. The total funding was just over $8 billion, with 4.76 approximately coming from Prop 1A fund, and the balance coming from the federal government with a small amount of local contribution. And I think one of the biggest points of what was passed was there's no guarantee at this point that the bookend funding is spent on the bookends. At this point, there is still the possibility that that money can be transferred to the Central Valley for the initial construction segment. So in talking, to go off of what John said, in cleaning up some of the follow-up language, getting a guarantee that that money is spent there might be something we'd be interested in too. So then just 2 quick caveats I had on there, what it means to Palo Alto and the implications of the blended system. I think in terms of what it means to Palo Alto, John and I discussed this yesterday. I think now our mission starts to lay out on 2 fronts. There's the opposition front, which we've been working on, which included legal avenues such as litigation, attorney general opinions on the legalities of things. Previously, I would have said a vote of support for the Revote High-Speed Rail Initiative, although that's no longer on the table. And then the continuing lobbying of the state legislature to no longer fund the project. But then on the other side, you have the involvement front, which is our continued engagement with the Caltrain blended system planning process. I know our transportation director, Jaime, has been working with them on their modeling and the implications of increasing non-grade separated trains in Palo Alto. And then our continued advocating for desired alignments and mitigations, et cetera, should a system be built. And then also our work with the regional groups such as the PCC and our involvement, although not formally, with the San Mateo County Rail Corridor Partnership. And then also, as John had mentioned before, and I know we're working on some stuff as well, our advocacy for better representation on some of these boards. So I think that's, when I say 2 fronts, there's, sort of like our guiding principles, we say, we oppose this project for these reasons, but if you do it, this is how we would like it to happen. So we have those 2 different pieces going on now that the funding has approved. In terms of the implications of the blended system, obviously there's still questions about the legality of it. There's the Attorney General's opinion, which people would still like to see if one has been created. There's also potential lawsuits that could be filed there from parties who are opposed to this project. I know that at the Peninsula Cities Consortium meeting 2 weeks ago, there was a sense there amongst a number of people that this blended system would be challenged in court because they felt it was not in line with Prop 1A. And then also, just to reiterate again, the project that was approved as a part of SB 1029 emphasized the blended system via the contribution to the bookends improvement. However, as I just said, that contribution to improving the bookends is not guaranteed. So I think a very important thing about the blended system is that although the authority is telling us that that's what they're interested in doing, we still do not have that in the environmental documents, and we still do not have the funding guaranteed to go there. So I think that at this point, counting on the blended system happening is not safe to do. So at this point, we look forward to public comment in your direction.
Okay. Let's hear from Elizabeth Alexis. Welcome.
Thank you. We were here till 11 last night on Charleston-Rotterdam Road. I think I'd sleep here one day. So I wanted to say a couple of things. I think this was in the paper yesterday, but you're aware of this, that the lack of the authority had another chance to go back and change to commit to the two-track system, which was in the negotiations over the program-level EIR litigation, and apparently the negotiations broke down over their unwillingness to go back on the program level and put in a two-track system. So I think,
Well, let me interrupt you by saying that since I was our representative at that meeting, I was rather surprised by Stuart's
interpretation.
I think he was doing some mind reading because the representatives of the authority never said anything. So we're limited by what we can say because there's a pledge of confidentiality that everybody has to take during a mediation. But I think Stuart really extracted more from their silence than might be justified.
So I would just say, though, there was an opportunity because it was being litigated, to go and make some change, some supplemental things to the program level, which they have chosen not to do. So whether that was a sticking point or not, right? I think there have been.
Carlson was there as well, so he might have been.
Fine.
Okay, so I would just say this: there's some constraints because of this concern that maybe you're going to create other opportunities for litigation by saying that the system is not legal once you commit to two tracks, which are not going to deliver a 2-hour and 40-minute system. That's the biggest issue they have, is that the blended system will not be as fast as not doing a blended system, but they also want to do detours to Palmdale, they want to do detours in a lot of places. So they have a problem that the overall system is probably not competitive, which is one of the things that, I think everybody here should understand, that a successful high-speed rail system and doing a blended system for 50 miles, you don't do blended for 50 miles with a train that stops every 2 miles anywhere in the world. So we do think, and nothing's happening for a long time. The issue that we think why it should be addressed in legislation, is that you just are left again with uncertainty, and you want to be able to, you have a rail task force. You'd like to be able to actually do something in the next 10 years. We have redevelopment issues going on with the downtown station right now. Cal Ave is continually under. You'd like to be able to do something, and until you have some true certainty, right? You're just stuck in limbo. And it could take a while for a project-level EIR to make its way through any kind of a process. The other thing we would just throw out, so if you're looking at the legislation about bill fixes, I think absolutely there is this provision in the current legislation. It's $1.1 billion right now for local, which is, first of all, is not. It's sort of understood to be $600 million for Caltrain and $500 million for Southern California, but that is not mentioned anywhere in the legislation. And I think our concern is that this will continue to have, where high-speed rail will have some leverage over Caltrain. If they don't cooperate, the money goes, the money either can go to Southern California without any changes, really, right? Or it can, then there's the second issue, which is that there is provision in there which just says explicitly, with one signature from the governor's finance department, it can go to these two other line items, one of which is the overhead for the High-Speed Rail Authority, and the other is the line item which the only permitted funding is for the Central Valley spending. And so finance is, this was because, what if it's not spent by the local in Southern California? It might not be spent by a local agency. High-Speed Rail might have to spend on behalf of these people, but the item itself that they're moving it into only has spending in the Central Valley. So you're going to have this perpetual threat that the money is going to move to Southern California, or if there are cost overruns in the Central Valley, which we understand there already are, that you're going to be at 80 miles, not 190 miles, not 130 miles, that the temptation will be at some point either to bring the money to that section, or, as I said, continue leverage over Caltrain to threaten that you're going to do this, which again puts Caltrain into something where it may not be able to advocate for itself properly, like we're talking about the Transbay Terminal and how it's being designed now, whether it will have adequate capacity for the Caltrain trains to go to the downtown station instead of being stuck out in 4th and King. So we think it's very important that we work creatively to find some way to get rid of that thing that says it can be moved. And we also think it's very important to tie down in the legislation how much is going to Caltrain and how much is going elsewhere. The other people have asked, does it really protect, it has this provision about 4 tracks. I mean, we think, I will not borrow any train metaphors, but, it's a gaping hole in the bill, and we have seen how things that look like protection, things that look like safeguards just don't work, and they don't mean anything. And this one, since you can already see how you get around, that it is just this money, you could use other money, that it doesn't really offer any kind of protection. And the one thing that we have seen over time that actually does protect communities is what Caltrans does. They have, basically, Caltrans must have a development agreement in place with the city before they can build highways through it. And we think that kind of provision, that they have to have a development, agreement with the city on the peninsula before, commencing high-speed rail operations. That's the only thing that we could see that could be baked into the bill that would give you any kind of protection. And so those are the couple of bill fixes we would say are the 3 most important ones, are to have some kind of a development agreement with the local community rather than specifying, this is back to what if somebody wants in there, instead of dictating the technology, is basically saying that the local, you have to have development agreement. 2 is to make sure that this money is not going to that Central Valley. I find some other way to fix this. There are other creative ways to do this administrative concern they have about who would be administering the money in Southern California. That might be through the MOU in Southern California. That might be in a lot of different ways you could do that. But take that item out of this bill. That's I think provision 2 under Section 3, and then the third thing would be to lock down the split of that 1.1 between Southern California and Northern California. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Smith, do you recall what's the role of the peer review committee going forward now that funding has been approved at this stage?
Well, they have a generic responsibility to respond to any kind of business plans. They just have this so they can be called, they can create a role for themselves. There was a line item in the budget for them, so they can actually have some money. So I would expect them to continue to do some letters and this and that. But what we found, this is again towards, things that you think are provisions, so they can, and they did say that the funding plan doesn't work and it's not adequate and whatever else, but that doesn't have any force of law whatsoever, and it turns out you can just ignore that. So, it's useful from the perspective that there is some kind of, somebody's out there saying something, but it turns out that they can give a thumbs down to something, but it doesn't matter. That's why they weren't subject to the to Bagley-Keene, because they didn't actually have any authority whatsoever. So they'll be around, but it's not a...
Well, I'd love to be around, but I can imagine 1 or 2 people in the more perhaps saying, nobody's going to listen to me at all. Why should I spend my time on this?
Well, I think it has created some issues. Especially for Will Kempton, who is... I think we understand, there was an issue a couple of years ago with the incompatible offices, and this is a doctrine of law which says you shouldn't hold 2 public hats where you could have a conflict, because unlike a conflict of interest where you have a private interest in your public role, where your public one just comes before your other one, and you just, you might have to disclaimer, you might have to do something else, that with 2 public hats, if they have a conflict, who do you say you're not representing? Right? And you can't do that. And so we saw that very clearly. While it was legal for Will Kempton to have both roles as the head of OCTA and on this peer review committee, because there was a specific legislative exemption for him, it was probably not a good idea, because it put him in a very, I think, uncomfortable position where his board was saying one thing and had one very specific role, and then he had some other.
Okay.
I have a question. John, are you there? John?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, I guess I wanted to get your reaction to Alexis's 3 legislative priorities on
I think that we are so lucky that we got it, Elizabeth, and we've got cards. Just keeping an eye on this stuff. It's a real asset to all of our efforts. I think that she's correct. I think that she's right. Now we need to tie down the legislation to make sure that the blended's in there. I think she's absolutely right that we need to, if rail could operate more like the Caltrans and the development agreements, it'd be important. It's very important, and that it's not tied down in legislation. Even defining what the blended is, as well as there's a lot of flexibility on where the money is going to go. And we have to realize by the time high-speed rail comes to the peninsula in its final form, we could have 2 or 3 legislatures turned over. And so trying to get that into the statute is very important. And, I'll talk to Elizabeth more about that. Yeah.
So I guess from my point of view, getting it tied down in terms of the money for Caltrains, I think that would probably be my priority on that. I think that's probably the most important thing. I mean, I definitely like this idea of the development agreements. I'm just concerned that seems like a much harder battle. I don't know what you think about the ability to get that done. I mean, that seems the high speed. I mean, if they're talking about getting rid of CEQA and NEPA, it seems hard that they would then want to tie their hands in terms of having a development agreement with each city.
We will have to see how this develops. I think that's something we'll have to explore more. Certainly, there continues to be conversations about high-speed rail going over Caltrans, in which case we'd be using more of the Caltrans model, manual, excuse me. But we'll have to investigate all those things.
One thing I just forgot to mention was we've been in conversation with the Pro Tem's office about this letter, and we did see a draft of, which we thought was the letter, but it turns out it's just a draft of the letter. And so they said there are changes continuing to be made, and it won't be published until the end of August. So back to the force of law, I mean, you have something the governor has signed, but you're going to have a letter that's after the fact, that's still being, I don't know, anyway, it's, as John said, our research into this has been that these letters come into play where there's ambiguity in the law itself. And our concern with this agreement has been very specifically about, our biggest concern is actually the ability to move the money out of this. And there's no ambiguity in that clause. It just says you can move it to this one specific account, which has one specific purpose. So we don't see where you'd be in we understand what finance was trying to do, but we would suggest that people who are there today might not be there when the desire to get money out. And as I said, it's even bigger is just this thing that hangs over Caltrain, the threat that you could do this, that there is a legal way to take the money from Caltrain. But yeah, so the agreement, I don't think this letter is done. It's very odd.
Pat?
Yes, in response to Councilmember Scharf's concern on whether they would be willing to do certain things if they're pushing for the CEQA exemption. The governor's pushing for the CEQA exemption. The legislature has been promised certain cleanup language, so they aren't one and the same in this case, and we're yet to see what the alignment will be in the future. But we have been told that the legislators have, including our local legislators, have been given this commitment on cleanup language, and they have this opportunity to address these issues. So I think that's a very important step for us. And what they are seeking may differ from what the governor would prefer, which kind of speaks to why this letter is being negotiated. And they're not all, both parties aren't aligned.
I do have to point out one thing that I think, Greg, you mentioned NEPA. Well, if the High-Speed Rail Authority is seeking some exemptions from NEPA, they're going to have a real uphill fight in Washington. That's I think that's a very different game. I haven't heard anybody saying that they were seeking exemptions from NEPA.
No. And I think there's the litigation that's going on now in the Central Valley will be both CEQA and NEPA based. But we are definitely hearing the CEQA stuff, and that the CEQA stuff will be tied to exemptions for water-related infrastructure, which is more of a Republican issue. So it may be something that's, I think it was very well, I'm quite impressed by the political skills of the people who are in the High-Speed Rail Authority at this point, right, and threatening the environmental exemptions was a way to get support for the project by withdrawing those from your environmental organizations. But we're hearing it's going to come back, and it will be again this, that you're going to lose the money, you're going to lose the money, you're going to lose the money. But I think they're worried. The issue that we have in the peninsula stuff is that the issues with development agreements, which are going to be more about, are going to be more about like how do you do a grade set rather than just a train, right, which I don't think you have any claim to do anyway. But, they're going to be worried that that's what Kings County will ask for I mean, that's why the development agreement is going to be tough, but I think Caltrans has learned the lesson that in the one place where there was a law that said where they were having trouble completing a freeway in Southern California and I think it's South Pasadena.
Yes.
And so they passed a law that said everybody gets a development agreement except for South Pasadena. Well, 30 or 40 years later, that is not done, and the trust levels are so low that they've offered to do a tunnel, right? And people don't even trust them to do a tunnel. So I think, it's very hard for people to accept sometimes that to get power, you give up power, right? And I think this is true in all sorts of life. But I mean, it's a tough thing. But I think in the long run, I mean, this is a much better way for agencies to do business.
Any further questions? Good.
Thanks.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Mr. Borak wants to speak to us on this item as well.
Thank you. I have not much to add because of Elizabeth Alex's excellent presentation. I believe one thing that's important, and this may be the division on the council, which is better to see in open session rather than to only have it in closed session of litigation, and that is what is principle. And to me, what is principle is the issue of high-speed rail. That is, if you make the principal thing what happens with Caltrain, you get trapped into the situation where if you get less than 2% of the funding for Caltrain, then you'll support all the funding of high-speed rail. And so that's why of the issues that Elizabeth mentioned, I think they're all important to get in cleanup language rather than to focus on just one thing. The summary, I guess you already had a letter I had at places at your council meeting on the bill, which Elizabeth has already mentioned some of the things, but also comparing it to the council's position in its letter to Senator Siminian, and also, I haven't seen yet until today, the other letter that you sent. There was one typographical error in the letter, which was quoting the language on transferring the money to the Central Valley and to administration. Instead of the word or, I had the word of. But it's in context, you can figure out what it is, and plus I had a link to the actual language for you to see. My concern on the fact that there's litigation going on at the same time that we're trying to do positions on legislation is that you are constrained in what you can say in public session. As far as Mr. Flashman's comments, I thought those were for the benefit of the public. Why he was doing that, I don't know. Certainly, those of you who have been involved in negotiations and those on the other side have been involved know exactly what went on. And the only people who are being fooled by Mr. Flashman's comments are the public, and I don't know why he's doing it. I hope he's not been directed by anybody to do it, and if he hasn't been, maybe he should be directed to stop doing it. Thank you.
Well, everybody wants to come to that to us, yes?
Turn my car.
Please.
I turn my
He says he turned one.
Oh, okay. Mr. LeBrun goes first. A letter.
The thing I really want to focus on is this full-track business and Elizabeth's assessment that they are going after full tracks. It's actually evident in the legislation language right now. The first thing I want to get across to you, I've mentioned this before, I come from the UK, and I have two blended systems either side of my house. They're the only systems in the country. One of them is a high-speed line to Paris, which if it wasn't blended would never be able to pay for itself. It has to have commuter rail on it. The other one is the North Kent line, which is the equivalent of Caltrain. The fact is, both systems are two tracks, period. Never ever pass a moving train. Okay? So in other words, blended and dedicated does not belong in the same sentence. It's an oxymoron. So let's look at the legislation now. It says, any funds appropriated in this system for Project San Francisco-San Jose corridor consistent with the blended system strategy and the April 2012 revised business plan shall not be used to expand the blended system to a dedicated four-track system. That got you right there. with the dedicated. There is nothing that is stopping them from building a four-track system with two dedicated tracks. If you're going to do any kind of cleanup of that legislation, it's right to dedicate it. Right there is the penultimate word just before four-track system. Thank you.
Thank you. Dina?
Caltrain, and with the passage of the high-speed rail funding, and in particular the passage of the funding for Caltrain electrification, clearly Palo Alto, as been discussed, is going forward in two fronts, and one is watchdog and opposing the project, and the other is working on the Caltrain electrification itself. And I would like to encourage Palo Alto, the concerns about a four-track system and the potential long-term events are happening relatively far into the future. In the most optimistic plans, high-speed rail trains are not going to get here until 2029 at the earliest, and the capacity of the blended system, as Caltrain analysis shows, is 2-4 trains per hour, and New York to DC and Paris to London are 3 or 4 trains per hour. So what they have proposed is going to hold them for a long time. And the Caltrain electrification is moving forward, and is the date that they're quoting is 2019, and that seems perfectly reasonable if not stretched out. So there's a lot to do here in Palo Alto and in the other cities on the corridor to pay very close attention to the details of that electrification project, the schedules, do we continue to have a bullet, grade separations, and how we get them funded, the details of land use around the station areas, including the need in Palo Alto and other cities to have crossing and bike and pedestrian access, and good land use around those stations as that land becomes even more desirable. The work to get DTX funded, the downtown extension to Transbay, which will even more greatly increase the value and utility of the Caltrain service. And those are things where there's going to be a ton of work going on in the next year and in the next several years, and I hope that Palo Alto gives that really important work the quality attention that it merits and that we really need in order to have a system that is going to be good for all of us.
Thank you. Okay, further discussion of the 1029 and what it means to us?
Yeah, just briefly. I have some sense, too, of what the most recent speaker just said, is that we need to have those discussions about Caltrain. And as Caltrain decided on electrification, because Richard, you said to modernize Caltrain, which we use as a euphemism not to make a decision about whether it's electrification or something else. So my question is Caltrain talking about anything other than electrification? They're not, right?
Caltrain has stated their preferred method of modernization, and only one under consideration right now is electrification. Palo Alto is not.
I'm not trying to take away from the fact of where we are in terms of opposing high-speed rail, but I do think we need to be early on in this in terms of understanding what Caltrain's doing and the effect on the peninsula and the effect on Palo Alto. And I would like to see more of those kind of things come back to us as well. I think that it could be a great thing for us, but I want to really understand what we're doing and how that works.
Well, Steve, you wanted to comment?
I just wanted to see if Richard had any update as to where Caltrain was on issuing the electrification EIR. They won't be able to do anything about recirculating.
Sure. So, an update from Meg Monroe. If I don't have the email with me, I can summarize. She told me that she recently attended with Jaime a meeting on their analysis of the grade crossings, and said that should be wrapped up this fall. And I believe that Caltrain is still trying, it's here, looking to circulate late 2013, the EIR. So I would say 15 months or approximately is a good window for when they're looking to circulate that. So I think that, you would like to have some lead time factored in there to get all of our policy positions that we'd like stated. I would say, and Steve can help me out here, a minimum of 6 months ahead of that. Minimum.
I think the potential for greatest impact is on the grade separations, whether they're grade separated or not, and if they are, how are they being done. So if we have that information, if they're true to their word, and deliver that in the fall, I think that could be a good platform for developing policy analysis and doing the technical work to find out what those specific impacts would be.
Pat?
Well, if we look at the various areas of interest, we do have within the Caltrain subject discussions that will occur around the design and the impacts. I think that those are important and not way out in the distance, but not our most immediate need, for instance, for today. I think our most immediate need to address issues is around cleanup legislation on high-speed rail. But on the Caltrain side, there's not only discussion around design, but it's the process by which we and other cities and stakeholders will have an opportunity to participate. And I think that's an important thing that we put attention on as soon as possible, so that when the specific technical issues come up, they're coming up within a sound process that we feel good about. The Peninsula Rail program, what's it called? The
San Mateo County Rail Corridor Partnership.
My understanding is at their last meeting, they came out in support of a concept that the PCC has been supportive of, and this committee has discussed, which is creating a advisory group similar to the BTA advisory group, where each city has a representative, and it's actually similar in structure to the policymaker working group that did exist for some time around high-speed rail. It was not a very effective group and needed to be improved, but it basically brings each city into a role in that discussion. It's also important to note that we still have on the books the original memorandum of understanding between high-speed rail and Caltrain. So we have an overlay of the current agreement between Caltrain and MTC, of which there's the agreement between the two of them, and then there's Caltrain's essentially unilateral assertion of rights that they have beyond what they agreed to with MTC. So that's an issue there. But in the old memorandum of understanding, under that old memorandum of understanding, the Peninsula Rail Program got the High-Speed Rail Authority to agree to context-sensitive solutions as the process for the peninsula. They never implemented it effectively. It's still on the books. It is still the process by which they have agreed to do the peninsula. And nobody's really been talking about it. We've been griping about that they didn't do CSS properly, and a lot of this was because things raced forward and we're going on a lot of different tracks. But I think there's an opportunity to say, this is what you agreed to, now we have time, let's go do it right. So those are a couple of statements on thoughts about process for Caltrain going forward, which would then lead to the technical discussions and impacts. I most of all, under this topic, want to talk about what we should direct staff to pursue as far as articulating the changes to the legislation that we think are important, which may be coming up in a matter of not too many weeks. And I'd be glad to speak to some of those separately, but I don't want to mix the conversation too much.
Well, we do have to figure out what we're going to do, so let me just make the comments, and then we'll see where we have some motions to direct staff. Well, I agree with most of what both of my colleagues have just stated as to what we need to do. But I would just want to point out a couple of things. One is that I'm not necessarily persuaded that Caltrain's modernization / electrification is good for Palo Alto or indeed our other communities. I think there are a number of questions that need to be answered before we really know that to be the case. I would point out one that really has not gotten much attention, though several people have pointed it out in the past. It's the effect on the canopy, that the creation of the wires above the tracks to handle electrification requires that the trees be cut back a certain number of feet around the right-of-way. And how far that would go and how it would affect our particular neighborhoods and so forth, I think is one of those things that seems like a small detail, but we care a lot about our canopy in this community, and suddenly to have a sort of 100-foot desert, just to pick a number out of it, I think would be something that our citizens might not welcome.
So I could just respond to that point. Mm-hmm. That's really what I was getting at. Is in the overarching thing, I think it's a great thing. I think it makes a lot of sense, but the devil's always in the details of this stuff. And you bring up a detail like that. And that's why I'd like to understand these details as quickly as possible. Because, you know, it's a 100-foot desert, or it's a 200-foot desert, or a 1,000-foot desert, you know, or if it's a 10-foot desert, it makes a huge difference. And I don't know where you got that number from.
But the 100 feet is well, I'm just using this as an example.
Well, that's what I figured, but it makes a big difference.
But it's not. It's not. Well, it's at least the right. Talking about at least the right of way and how much beyond the right of way. So 100 feet. While I created it, it's not out of the realm. It's not unreasonable.
Right. I'm just saying that the details seem very important on this, and it's going to take a long time to work through them and understand.
I agree with that. Yeah.
So that's what I'd like to see. Surface those things early.
And the other one I want to mention before we get on that our morning newspaper a week or so ago had a story that Caltrain was now at least studying the idea of a third track that would run from Palo Alto to San Mateo. If you have some more information on that?
Yeah, I mean... Okay, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it is true statement. I think this was done at the request of cities like San Mateo, which are now slotted to be on the 4-track, that limited part that needs 4 tracks. And for them, they have the narrowest right-of-way in their downtown area, so 3 tracks work, but 4 tracks are pretty impactful. So they asked to specifically study whether you could do 3 tracks for a longer distance. My understanding from Caltrain is that basically makes no sense that, you know, the costs of doing something are roughly commensurate with the distance at which you have to expand, because once you go beyond 2 tracks, the state regulators are almost 100% going to require grade separation. So from Caltrain's perspective, having to do 3 tracks over twice the distance will basically double their costs. So I think the answer is going to come back that makes no sense, but it was done at the request of some of the cities, which is not who would face more impact than we would. I mean, so I mean, I personally think it's not an unreasonable thing. You know, ask the question, and people will, if you don't look at that analysis to see why you're not doing 3 tracks for longer, you'll have these cities which are under the gun of 4 tracks, right? Always saying, well, we could have done this, we could have done this. But I think it makes sense to look at it, but I think it's incredibly unlikely that that's going to come back as a viable option.
Well, I hope that's right, but we have not previously talked about a 3rd track all the way from Palo Alto to San Mateo.
Can I speak?
Wait.
Actual information, Marion Lee presented.
Okay, go ahead.
At the San Mateo County Rail Corridor Partnership, Marion Lee presented an update. Marion Lee presented an update on Caltrain modernization. She had a set of slides, and in the set of slides, it showed a high level of what all the options were that they were looking at and a high-level interim findings. So there's information on slides that were presented in public.
What did she say, though?
So she didn't actually talk about the costs, so that's actually new information over what she presented. And rather than quoting by memory, I would recommend actually getting the slides.
I have the slides if you want them.
Okay, we're not about to discuss the third track, okay?
All right. Can I say something?
30 seconds. We're getting out of our procedures.
Okay, two things. 3 tracks. Caltrain keeps telling you there is no need, the FRA does not require grade separation if you do less than 125 miles an hour. That's true. What's going to happen the minute that you add a single track, regardless of what speed you're going at, the CPUC will force you to have grade separation everywhere, period. Now, with regards to the trees, the fastest line...
We really want to stay focused, okay?
Well, you brought up the trees.
All right, please complete it, because we want to get focused on what we want to do today.
I'm going to send Richard a link to a YouTube video that shows you the fastest line anywhere in the world. It's Paris to Strasbourg. It's 200 miles an hour, and you will see the trees wrapping themselves around the poles, okay, while you are in urban areas. And then once you're up in the open space, then it's different. Okay, thank you.
Just to complete the story on the third track in the Daily did quote Marion Lee. So where it is, whether it's a threat or whether it's not, I don't know, but it was a new topic for me anyway.
I'd like to agendize this for...
Yes, let's do that. All we're trying to do right now is give direction to staff. We're not trying to come to a decision on destruction of the canopy, third track, or any of it. We're just getting ourselves organized. Okay. So I think that I think we have at least 2 different strands here. One is to think through or schedule meetings on Caltrain's proposed modernization and electrification. And second is what we should be requesting on any cleanup legislation that comes along. Is there a third or fourth?
Well, I would just break the first one into 2 aspects. One is discussion around the modernization plan itself, and the other is the process that would occur that would guide the input of cities and stakeholders in that modernization. So I think the process issues are a separate category from an outcome discussion.
Okay. I'd agree with that. Okay, so the direction from the committee is for you to start preparing us on those 2 categories. I guess there's a third one, but which is a little bit vaguer, and that is the discussed legislation to provide a permanent funding source for Caltrain. Because when you mentioned the process and decision making, when we have that before us, I think that's a perfect time for us to be talking about changes in how Caltrain is governed and how it interacts with its communities. So when we say direction to the staff, I think we're talking about meetings in the fall on these issues. But agreed?
Agreed.
Okay.
But the cleanup legislation we hadn't talked about.
Yes,
That will
no.
happen in 2 or 3 weeks.
Yes, all right. Cleanup legislation. What do we want to do? Pat?
I have actually a number of different areas of concern, and so what I think perhaps we should do today is identify those areas, not attempt to refine our recommendations, but request that staff come back after they have been able to evaluate it, discuss it with our representatives in Sacramento, and receive input from various stakeholder groups who have expertise to take what I'd be perfectly glad to offer a number of concern areas, and we would have to have an opportunity to review that before the cleanup legislation would go to the legislature, so presumably in August.
Well, we've heard different dates.
We don't. That's right. We don't know yet. So that would be one thing that I can try to find out from Assemblymember Gordon's office the update. It was Assemblymember Gordon who had spoken to me about what I understood to be an opportunity and even a commitment he had received from the legislative leadership to address this starting in late August at that session.
Well, late August, that is consistent with what I think Elizabeth stated, that you were talking about something like end of August, the letter of intent between the governor and...
Yeah. I mean, there's nobody left in Sacramento right now. I mean, that's part of it also.
So those are two different things.
No, I understand. I'm just concerned as to when we're going to meet again. So I understand. I agree with the assignment. John, you still there?
I'm still here, yes.
Do you have any feeling as to when the legislature would be getting a cleanup bill and when we need to provide our input by?
I'm sorry, I don't. I think it could be August, but it could be later.
What are the precise? When does the legislature reconvene, and what's their schedule?
August 6th they come together, and I believe they run till September, first week in September. They have to wrap up their business.
Oh, that's
sooner.
I don't mind meeting again during break.
Okay, well, I think that John's input really narrows our focus. Okay, thanks, John. So what's our schedule here?
Based upon the legislature reconvening the week of August 6th, and which is even sooner than I had understood, and assuming that next week is too soon, I would suggest we consider August 9th.
It's okay with me?
Yeah, I'm here.
So August 9th doesn't really work for me unless we do it. The worst thing I can do Friday the 10th. I know we normally meet on Thursdays, but
Well, that's fine.
I have to be in court at 10, and I have doctor's appointment at 8:45.
That's okay.
It's just,
Too much information.
well, I know, it's just not working.
Right. All right. Either Friday the 10th or Wednesday the 8th?
Wednesday the 8th doesn't work. I can do Friday the 10th, or we can do the following day.
No, I'm worried that with the legislature only meeting for a month. Friday, August 10th, 8:30.
Okay.
All right. And staff, you feel you've got enough information as to...
I was hoping we were going to do a discussion now on what general topics for...
Oh, sure, go ahead.
All right, so my notes are, and these are not necessarily comprehensive, but I think I've captured most of it, that two aspects around the funding for the bookends. One is concern that the dollars can be transferred to the Central Valley merely based upon the Department of Finance, or essentially the governor's determination. Second, that the dollars aren't specified in the legislation as to how many dollars go to which bookend. Second, that the legislation appears to indicate that the restrictions on the funding not being able to go to 4 tracks are limited to this go-round funding. That future funding could go to 4 tracks. Next, that and this goes to several of the points that we made and we were requesting as changes previously, that the project level EIR must be limited to the blended system, and that should be in legislation. That Caltrain be the lead agency on the peninsula. That two things related to, or maybe several related to the role of cities and in decisions made that would significantly affect it. And this might be done through advocating that there be a process similar to what currently exists for Caltrans on freeways, that there be a development agreement or some way that what we had asked for previously of us having a role in the determination of whether grade separations would occur, and if so, what form.
Could I stop you on that?
Yeah.
I worry when you put forth a number of proposals that if you put one in there that's totally unreasonable, that it colors everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And I worry about the Caltrans solution. I'd love to have sort of a veto over high-speed rail, but I think that would. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think that's an unreasonable.
The Caltrans solution. What did you mean by that?
Where they have to put the highways.
Oh.
So I think we have to carefully craft what we're asking for. Because we're not going to get a veto over high-speed rail coming from Palo Alto.
So that was actually a item that you had pushed to have in our letter of what we requested the legislators to put in the high-speed rail.
Oh, I know that's a different thing. That we're in a different position now, and we're asking what our legislators who they think they can get.
So part of the reason that I framed it the way I did is that I didn't speak about a veto, which your prior language essentially did speak to. I think there are a number of shades of gray that this could come in forms. And so the issue is the role of cities on the construction that would occur within them. And I do actually think that there is adequate, strong precedent in other major transportation areas where the argument is, why shouldn't the accepted role of cities in these kinds of projects that exists in freeways apply to rail? I don't think that's an unreasonable argument. We may not obtain it, but I think that's a foundation for discussions, and frankly, I haven't looked at the details of what that would mean, but I think that's the framework.
Well, anyway, I think we have to frame it carefully. Actually, I think what we asked for in our previous thing was the vetoes over grade separation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, not the whole thing.
Well, but we've already had and had some agreement on that what's another major element is elevated structures. And that, in theory, is part of the blended system.
Okay.
So I think the topic area is what is the role of cities in the major outlets that for a high-speed rail system that would pass through them.
I agree on the topic. Now, what are we asking for?
We're asking for staff to come back with an evaluation of alternatives that, including comparing to what is currently the process by which Caltrans puts freeways through cities.
Okay.
And
Greg is nodding his head.
Okay. But not limited to that. I mean, if there are other ways in which they think that we could articulate a role for the cities that have a good chance of receiving support, then I'd like to hear that too.
Yeah. So it's correct in assuming that Caltrans has a long-standing practice of entering into freeway agreements with cities when there's a freeway going through a local jurisdiction. They're no more generous than high-speed rail. The only reason they do that is that they need to close local streets in order to build those. The same thing would happen here if there was a grade crossing. We would have to close streets either temporarily or permanently. So the city will have some sort of standing on this. Now, if there's legislation that countermands that removes some of the city's local control over its own right-of-way, that's a concern if they try to weaken that. But as it stands now, the city will have some standing in negotiation because we'll have a seat at the table because we have control of right-of-way that they will need even on a temporary basis.
Well, we can phrase it that way. What we asked for previously was, to be specific, was that we have decision-making over grade separations, and if there were to be any grade separations, that the authority pay for it. And I still think that we want to.
Right. No, of course. But in terms of us having some place at the table, there will be, unless that's taken away by legislation.
So this might be both an offensive and a defensive measure. And then another item is opposing that the legislation would have the funding be based upon no dilution of the CEQA requirements. And then this clarification of the issue of the language in the legislation around whether it's a dedicated 4-track or 4-track at all. And so that issue as well. So those are the ones that I had.
Hey, could you just repeat all 4 of them quickly?
So there's more like half dozen.
Could you just run through them just to make sure?
The bookend funding, both that it can be transferred to the Central Valley and that it's clear what our bookend gets. The project EIR limited to the blended system. The future funding can't go to a 4-track. And what the role of cities would be in determining major impacts on their communities, in particular on grade separations. No dilution of CEQA requirements for the project. I think that captures it.
I'm good with that.
Me too. Did I see a couple of hands? Elizabeth, did you have your...
I mean, this was just back to the, I actually think there's very little, there appears to be very little protection for local jurisdiction over the closing of local roads. In the Central Valley, every other road, right now they're on a grid system where there's every half mile there's a road that goes across, and they're going to go to where there's only every 2 miles a road across, and I can assure you that the local jurisdictions are not happy about this, but they don't seem to have, because it's only Caltrans, it's not Caltrans doing this, it's high-speed rail, and one of their specific authorities under their enabling legislation is to move highways and move roads. So I don't think you have actually any, I haven't seen any, I haven't seen local jurisdictions be able to do anything in the Central Valley. Anything.
So my point was that to use the Caltrans model, which has been litigated over many decades, there has been standing given to the local jurisdiction in control of their right.
Right, because there is stuff with Caltrans, right? But I'm saying, like, there is nothing with high-speed rail doesn't, the same rules. I mean, it is a very specific part of legislation that specifically mentions Caltrans as the agency that has to have these agreements.
So all I'm saying is that there's legal precedent.
Oh, yes, absolutely right. I would agree.
We have huge, body of litigation and decisions that would support.
Right. And I think it's been workable. So I think there is reason to say that you could craft something that's not veto power over high-speed rail, but really does give you veto power over how it is. Like if you actually have to do construction for it, how that construction is done. So I do think, and it has been shown to be workable, so I think it is a reasonable, whether it is achievable or not, because they are going to be concerned, obviously, with what's going on in Central Valley.
Mr. LeBrun, did you have your hand up? Okay.
Okay, we got our list.
All right. Item number 4 on our agenda is discussion of possible revisions and updates to our guiding principles, and this is really Nancy's item, so I will move we continue it, so she can have input.
Second?
All in favor? Aye. Okay. We have any reports on meetings of the authority, the PCC, or the
I can, real quick, couple updates. On July 16th, the authority released a revised draft EIR for the 114-mile Fresno to Bakerfield project. Just want you to be aware of that. The comment closes for that August 30th. Their next meeting is August 2nd in Sacramento. They have a number of items on their agenda. But I thought one of the more interesting things is if you take a look at the agenda, you'll notice that in their closed session, their list of litigation is growing steadily. They're now up to 7 cases that they're dealing with, and I would expect that list to keep growing. So we'll do our best to keep an eye on that, but I think it's of significance. As they try to move through this project, a lot of people are exploring the legal avenue. Next thing would be the PCC met, I believe it was July 13th. They're sort of the consensus amongst a number of members of the public and the elected officials, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, was much of what Palo Alto said. A lot of disappointment in the process that was used to pass the legislation, and then a number of comments were made about the next steps. CEQA exemptions were mentioned, again, to keep an eye out on those, and potential litigation. And then also the issue came up of the possible political impacts of those elected officials who voted yes for this project and how that would play out. Also, Seamus Murphy is asked to do an update at the next PCC meeting from Caltrain now that SB 1029 is passed. So what I'll do based on the discussion we had today around the 3-track option, ask him to do a similar presentation here to that. And then the next meeting there is August 2nd at 10 a.m., assuming it's, or Friday, August 3rd at 8:15 a.m., assuming it's not pushed back. And then the Peninsula Quarter Joint Powers Board has their next meeting scheduled for August 2nd at 10 a.m. That was kind of a lot. Were there? Is that clear? Okay.
Mr. LeBrun?
Well, very briefly on the San Mateo meeting, and I can either show it to you, Do you want to see it? Or I can read it to you. It's 15.6 miles from Hayward Park to Cala. That's where it's going. And the others are here. You want to see them?
Well, Richard, do we have copies?
Yeah, I have a copy of that I can send out. That's the alternatives for the passing tracks, right?
Just send it to you, right?
Yeah.
He has it.
This is 513.
Yeah. Awesome, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else for the good of the cause?
One housekeeping item. Our next regularly scheduled meeting for this group is Thursday, August 23rd. Do you want to keep that meeting on the schedule? I know it's during your break.
I think we do because with the legislature adjourning on September 6th or whatever that date was that John gave us, we might want to take some action. We're going to send this letter off after our meeting on August 10th, and we don't know what's going to be happening in the legislature, so let's keep it on and see where we go.
Okay. That's all.
All right. Meeting's adjourned.
All right.